Today's lesson is how storms are named. Hi, everybody. I'm Roger.
And I'm Mike.
And today we're going to talk about storms, especially big storms like typhoons and hurricanes, and in some instances, cyclones. Again, those kinds of storms are different. They're called different names. They're basically the same kind of storm, but they happen in different parts of the world. A hurricane happens in the Caribbean Sea and the Eastern Pacific, and typhoons happen here in Asia. And then if you're close to India, it's going to be called a cyclone. But those big storms are often given names. And where do they get these ideas from? Where do they get these names from?
That's true. They're always named after people or things. And I think there's a list. I think they go alphabetically. Sometimes if it's the beginning of the storm season, they'll have the ABC names and then later on. But yeah, where do they pick them from? Is there a big book of storm names that all the weather people in the world have? Well, very interesting. And it actually does have a bit of an interesting story. And maybe you'll even be able to look up the storm that carried your name and see what kind of death and destruction it caused. So let's find out how storms are named, and at the same time maybe hope that there won't be a terrible storm named after us, at least in our lifetime. How storms are named. One of the reasons people remember terrible storms is because of the ordinary names that extraordinary storms are given. For example, Hurricane Andrew and Hurricane Katrina are still remembered decades after they wreaked havoc in the U.S.
大家好，第一部分介绍名词 hurricane， 它的意思是飓风。例如 When the hurricane hit the United States, many people lost their homes. 那个飓风侵袭美国的时候，许多人失去了家园。或者 Be sure to stock up on batteries, candles, and food before a hurricane. 请务必在飓风来临之前储备电池、蜡烛和食物。
Okay, so we're trying to answer the question, how are storms named? Well, we're going to tell you how storms are named. Here in the first paragraph it says, one of the reasons people remember terrible storms is because of the ordinary names that extraordinary storms are given. Okay, so yes, indeed, if you have those terrible storms, we try to remember them because of their names, okay? Small storms, they don't get those kinds of names, like a thunderstorm in the afternoon during the summer, and that's not big enough to give it a name. But in this particular case, we're talking about big storms, and we remember them because of the names that they were given. Who could forget Typhoon Morakot? Way back in 2009, that was the most damaging typhoon that Taiwan has had in recent history. So, of course, the name helps us remember the storm. And yes, we're talking about these extraordinary storms. If something's extraordinary, it's beyond the ordinary. It's not normal. It's not usual. It is an extreme case. So these are really big storms that caused a lot of damage, and everybody's going to remember them for a long time.
That's right. For example, it says Hurricane Andrew and Hurricane Katrina are still remembered decades after they wreaked havoc in the U.S. Those are two storms that people will still remember. I think Hurricane Andrew, that was in the 1990s, and I believe it hit Florida, Homestead, Florida, possibly. May have been the town that was devastated by that powerful storm, or hurricane. And hurricanes, we should mention, are basically typhoons in the Atlantic Ocean. I believe if it's in the northern Atlantic Ocean, so America, the Caribbean, Mexico, places like that, we will call them hurricanes. Over here, they might be typhoons. In the Indian Oceans, you might call them cyclones or something like that. But these are just really big storms, pretty much exactly the same weather-wise as a typhoon. So Hurricane Andrew hit Florida, I believe, in the 90s. Hurricane Katrina, a lot of people remember that, devastated New Orleans and flooded much of the city, killing hundreds or thousands of people and forcing millions to leave their homes. And I believe New Orleans is still kind of recovering from Katrina. So these are still remembered decades after they wreaked havoc in the U.S., 10, 20 years, generations even later, after after they wreaked havoc. Havoc is chaos, and to wreak havoc is sort of to cause chaos, to cause widespread death and destruction and things like that. If you let a bull loose in a china shop, it might wreak havoc. If you let a lot of children with too much Coca-Cola and candy in them into your home, they might wreak havoc in your living room, running around and jumping on the sofa and knocking things over. So just kind of causing chaos and destruction in various different ways. So yes, these storms are very much remembered, and people still refer to them, I think, even by the first name, right? When Katrina came, oh, the whole city changed. People in New Orleans will still talk about them like that to this day. Let's find out more about some of those names and where they came from in the next paragraph. Yet storms didn't always have names. Historically, they were identified solely by the year and/or location of their occurrence. For instance, the Great Hurricane of 1780. The practice of naming storms can be traced back to the British meteorologist Clement Wragge. In the 1890s, Wragge started naming storms after women, mythical figures, and even politicians. In the 1940s, American meteorologists adopted a similar practice, giving storms female names, often those of their wives or girlfriends. This approach was formalized in 1953 when the National Weather Service drew up a list of female names that could be used. Male names were only added in 1979 after women complained that the naming convention was offensive.
第二部分看到这个副词 solely 表示仅仅、指或是完全。例如 Recruiting a manager will be solely your responsibility. 主管的招聘将完全由你负责。或是 Most visitors come to this town solely for the first-rate restaurants. 大多数游客来到这个小镇只是为了品尝一流的餐厅。下一个看到名词 occurrence 指发生或是出现。例如 The sudden occurrence of heavy rain caused flooding in several areas. 突然发生的暴雨导致多个地区淹水。也可以说 The occurrence of natural disasters has increased in recent years. 近年来，自然灾害的发生频率有所增加。接着介绍形容词 offensive 表示冒犯的、无理的或是令人反感的。我们可以说 The car was painted an offensive shade of lime green. 这台车漆了令人反感的亮绿色。又或者说A lot of people found the comedy show to be offensive. 很多人觉得这个搞笑节目让人不舒服。
Okay, so here's the next part of our lesson. Of course, as you know, storms nowadays have names, but still, storms did not have names in the past. They always did not have names in the past. Historically, they were identified solely by the year and or location of their occurrence. Okay, so that's how we identified them in the past, solely by the year and location. So solely here just means only by the year or the location. That's how we called them. And here we're talking about the occurrence. That just means when something happened. The verb is to occur, like the incident happened or the incident occurred in this particular location. So here we're talking about the occurrence of these hurricanes. They were solely given the name because of their location and the time. For instance, or for example, we have the Great Hurricane of 1780. Okay, so it did not have a name. It happened in the year 1780, and that's what they called it, the Great Hurricane of that particular year.
The practice of naming storms can be traced back to the British meteorologist Clement Wragge. All right, so Clement Wragge is the person we can credit for naming storms and not just giving them that kind of location and date type of name. So this practice, this tradition, or this sort of thing that weather people do, this not quite a rule or regulation, but basically the culture and the tradition of doing it can be sort of traced back. If we follow the history back, we meet this gentleman named Clement Wragge. He's a meteorologist, so it makes sense that he would be interested in storms because a meteorologist is a weather scientist, basically. Often when you watch television, that person giving you the weather for tomorrow isn't just a good-looking person on TV pointing at a map. They often know about the weather, and they've studied meteorology in school, the science of weather. So he was the first person to do this. It says in the 1890s, when a lot of the world was getting organized and science was becoming a bit more of a common thing to use in daily life, Rags started naming storms after women, mythical figures, and even politicians. So he decided that having these dates and these locations, it was just a little complicated and took up a lot of space in their research papers or something. So he started this tradition of naming them. He was naming them after women, mythical figures, so figures from myths. So there might be Storm Odin or Storm Zeus or Storm Aphrodite or something like that, gods and creatures from myths and legends of the past, and even name them after politicians. That would be quite an interesting one. Hurricane Liz Truss just came through and devastated England or something like that. So he decided we should come up with names because it just makes it easier to reference these, to categorize them, and to talk about them without having all these dates and places and whatnot. It's a little unwieldy, a little complicated. Let's just give them nice, simple names.
Now here in the next paragraph it says, in the 1940s, American meteorologists adopted a similar practice, giving storms female names, often those of their wives or girlfriends. So now we're going to the 1940s in the USA. They gave these storms female names, okay? They would give them the names of their wives or their girlfriends. Oh, this is a Hurricane Lisa or Hurricane Agatha or whatever. Yeah, they would just give them those names of girls they knew, basically. I don't think they gave them the names of their sisters or their mothers. That would probably be too disrespectful.
Well, you have to see your sister and your mother every year at Thanksgiving, so maybe not, yeah. But it says, next as we go on, this approach or this practice, this method of naming storms was formalized in 1953 when the National Weather Service drew up a list of female names that could be used. So it kind of became common practice in the world of meteorology. And then eventually they decided to kind of make it a rule or make it a system. When you formalize things, you kind of put them in a system, you establish them, you make rules. We often think of sports rules being formalized in the 1800s. People were playing soccer or golf or different sports, baseball, for many years before. But eventually someone says, hey, let's write a rule book so we all know the rules. The people in this part of the country play it slightly differently than the people over here. So let's kind of establish it as a bit more of an organized formal thing. So they formalize things and make rules and regulations about it. This happened in 1953 when the National Weather Service, the government department in charge of weather and weather predictions and studying meteorology, they drew up, basically they created. When you draw up something, you aren't actually drawing it like a picture. You're just creating something, often writing in a document form or something. You might draw up a will or draw up a contract or draw up a list of things to buy at the store, that kind of thing. So they drew up a list of female names that could be used. So they're like, instead of just picking your girlfriend or your wife or sister's name, let's pick some names and we will use these same names.
Right, and of course they wanted to use female names, I guess, because we think of nature in terms of female things like Mother Nature, for example. So they, of course, thought that women's names would be more appropriate for that. And yes, indeed, that practice probably was criticized by women. Hey, we're not those terrible storms, so why are you doing this? So yes, indeed, male names were only added in 1979 after women complained that the naming convention was offensive. Okay, so women spoke up. The women said, no, you can't keep naming those storms after women only. You can still name them after us, but you also have to name them after men as well. We're going to make things equal here, 50-50. So they complained that that convention was offensive. Here, convention just means tradition, that way of doing things. And if something's offensive, well, it offends you, it insults you, it makes you feel bad because of something somebody did or said. Usually it's because of what somebody said. Some people think it's offensive, it's insulting to people of a certain disposition. Okay, we're at the end of the second part of our explanation for today. Let's move on now to the third part.
Today, the World Meteorological Organization oversees the naming of both hurricanes and typhoons, using comprehensive lists provided by member nations. These lists include both male and female names, as well as the names of various plants, animals, and famous heroes. The names are reused every few years, But if a storm is particularly destructive, its name is removed from the list and never used again.
第三部分看到动词 oversee， 意思是监管或是监督。例如 As the project manager, Sam will oversee the entire construction process. 身为专案经理 Sam 将监督整个建设过程。再看一个例子 An expert oversaw the renovation of the stately home. 一名专家监督了这座豪宅的装修。继续看到形容词 comprehensive， 它表示完整详尽的、综合性的或是全面的。可以说 The school offers a comprehensive curriculum for all grades. 该学校为所有年级提供完整详尽的课程。也可以说 The textbook provides a comprehensive overview of world history. 该课本对世界史提供了全面的概述。最后看到这个单字 destructive， 它是形容词，指的是具毁灭性的或是破坏的。举例来说 A meteorite hitting the Earth would have a destructive impact. 陨石撞地球会有毁灭性的冲击力。或者 Woodrow's parents are getting worried about his increasingly destructive behavior. Woodrow 的父母越来越担心他日益严重的毁灭性行为。
Okay, we are back with the third part of our article, looking at the naming of big storms. So we've already learned about the history of this a little bit, and by 1979, it was sort of formalized that storms were given either male or female names, and that's why storms like Andrew and Katrina that we read earlier are so well known. Now, we learn today, so in modern times, the World Meteorological Organization oversees the naming of both hurricanes and typhoons, using comprehensive lists provided by member nations. So before it was probably a little bit more local. The National Weather Service, part of the U.S. government, they would name storms in the Atlantic Ocean, the kind of hurricanes that would hit America. But now it's a global thing. It's a global system, and it's overseen by the WMO. To oversee something is basically to kind of control it. You're the boss, but in a fairly indirect way. We might think of parents overseeing their children. So the mom's just hanging around while the kids play. They're not actually guiding them or leading them or even taking part in what the kids are doing. They're just sort of observing and making sure that everything goes okay. So this is overseen by the World Meteorological Organization. They name both hurricanes in the Atlantic and typhoons in the Pacific, and they have a big or comprehensive list, and it's provided by member nations. So they might ask countries around the Pacific area, the Pacific Rim, Japan, Korea, Taiwan, Malaysia, Indonesia, places like that get affected by typhoons. Give us some names for typhoons. Basically, these countries will provide them with names, and they will create a list, a comprehensive list, a list that covers many different languages, many different cultures, names from many different countries, and this is used by the member nations. So every year, as the storms happen, they just go down the list and they give the names out.
And they have that list. I don't think they look at a storm and think, what should we call it? Let's pick a name of the list we have here. I think they probably are in order or something like that. And then whatever storm is next, it gets the next name on the list. So again, this list includes males and females, as well as the names of various plants, animals, and famous heroes. So we don't just have the names. We've got plants like aloe vera or something like that, or rose or whatever, or oak tree. We've got different animals like the kangaroo hurricane or whatever. Of course, that wouldn't be happening in the Americas area because kangaroos are by Australia. If they had a cyclone by Australia, they might call it cyclone kangaroo or whatever. But in any case here, they use different names of plants and animals and also famous heroes like Hercules or somebody like that.
Very, very interesting. The names are reused every few years, but if a storm is particularly destructive, its name is removed from the list and never used again. Well, that's very interesting. Often these storms don't even make the news, right? There are storms that form out in the middle of the Atlantic or Pacific. They don't go nowhere. They kind of blow themselves out after a few days. So they reuse many of the names because they can't just keep coming up with names year after year. They would run out of ideas eventually. So they reuse the names. But if a storm is particularly destructive, if it is very damaging, being destructive, being damaging, if it's very devastating, if it's very big, powerful, hits the land and destroys a lot of big area and kills a lot of people, for example. Well, it kind of reaches the Storm Hall of Fame, and they remove the name from the list, and they never use it again. So I guess we can never expect to have another Hurricane Katrina, for example, because that one is so closely connected to that storm from the early 2000s that hit New Orleans. So they're never going to use that name again. Very interesting. So I guess we'll never have another Morakot or something like that.
Yeah, I think that's been retired. Yeah. But I think Typhoon Herb, which was pretty bad back in 1996, I think, that name was not retired. So in the future, there might be another Hurricane Herb or Typhoon Herb. We'll just have to wait and see. Okay, that brings us to the end of our explanation for today. It's time now to hear from our Chinese teacher, Hanny.
各位同学大家好，我是 Hanny。 今天的课文是关于风暴如何命名 How storms are named。 那我们来看看文章里面的5个题目。第一题他提到 Yet storms didn't always have names. Historically, they were 空格 solely by the year and or location of their occurrence。 题目意思是在历史上他们仅以发生的年份和或地点来空格。这题考我们字汇，来看选项 A. Celebrated 是庆祝， B. Identified 是识别辨别， C. Disguised 表示掩饰伪装， D. Symbolized 表示象征代表。课文前一句提到风暴并非都有名字，那可以推断这句是要表达在历史上他们仅以发生的年份和或地点来识别辨别。那最适合答案是 B. Identified， 其他3个选项语义都不符合。第二题他提到 The practice of naming storms can be 空格 The British meteorologist 题目意思是为风暴命名的做法可空格英国气象学家。那么本题测验片语动词，空格前面是 be 动词，那4个选项都是以分词开头，可以判断是被动用法。看看选项 A. Traced back to 表示追溯至B. Referred to as 表示被称为什么， C. Passed down to 表示被传承给什么， D. Put up with 表示被忍耐被忍受。如果我们偷看课文下一句，他提到在1890年代这位英国气象学家开始以女性神话人物甚至政治人物的名字来替风暴命名，可以判断前一句应该是在说明风暴命名的起源，因此最适合答案是 A. Traced back to 去表达追溯至那么第3题他提到 In the 1890s, rag 空格 storms after women, mythical figures, and even politicians。 那题目的4个选项都有动词 start 和 name， 可以了解这句的意思是在1890年代拉格开始以女性神话人物甚至政治人物的名字来替风暴命名。这题考我们时态，来看选项 A. Have started to name， B. Was starting to name， C. Started naming， D. Could have started naming。 那么动词 start 后面它可以接不定词 to V 或者是接动名词 VING， 所以呢只能从动词 start 的时态来决定正确答案。而句子的开头 in the 1890s 这是过去时间，而且开始命名它不是持续的动作哦，所以呢应该要使用过去式，那正确答案就会是 C. Started naming。那么选项 A. Have started to name 它是现在完成式， B. Was starting to name 这是过去进行式， D. Could have started naming 表示当时应该开始命名但是却没有这么做。那这3个选项都不符合句意。看到第4题他提到 Male names were only added in 1979 after women complained that the naming 空格 was offensive。 题目意思是男性的名字则是在女性抗议这种命名空格具有冒犯性后才在1979年被列入。那这题是来考我们字汇，我们来看选项 A. Convention 它表示惯例常规， B. Demonstration 表示示范说明示威活动， C. Enforcement 表示实施执行， D. Achievement 表示成就成绩或是达成。那课文前一句提到1953年正式以女性的名字为风暴命名，当时美国国家气象局还拟定了一份可被使用的女性名字清单。那从上下文意可以判断说最适合答案是 A. convention， 表达说在女性抗议这种命名惯例具有冒犯性后，男性的名字才在1979年被列入。那其他3个选项语义都不符合。再来看到第5题，他提到 These lists include both male and female names, 空格 the names of various plants, animals, and famous heroes。 题目意思是这些名单包含男性和女性的名字，空格各种动植物与著名英雄的名字。那这题考我们连接词，来看选项 A by means of 透过点点点 B with regard to 关于点点点 C on account of 表示因为由于 D as well as 可以表达和以及。那课文前一句提到世界气象组织使用成员国提供的完整名单来监管飓风和台风的命名。那题目句子则提到这些名单包含男性和女性的名字，空格各种动植物与著名英雄的名字。我们可以推断它是列举了各种命名方式，那最适合答案会是 D as well as 去表达和以及的意思。那其他3个选项语义都不符合。好，那么以上就是今天的讲解，我们来回顾今天的单字吧。
Extraordinary. The museum has an extraordinary mixture of art from all around the world. Hurricane. Strong winds and heavy rain from the hurricane caused the airport to cancel all flights. Solely. In spite of rumors to the contrary, Irvin was promoted based solely on his performance. Occurrence. The occurrence of earthquakes in this region has increased in recent years. Offensive. Some words that were viewed as acceptable in the past are now considered offensive. Oversee. A team of experts will oversee the project's progress to ensure its success. Comprehensive. This book provides readers with a comprehensive guide to English sentence structures. Destructive. The wildfire's intense flames were highly destructive, reducing entire forests to ashes and destroying numerous homes.
Well, that brings us to the end of another edition of our program, and please make sure you join us again next time. From all of us here, I am Roger.
I am Mike.
See you next time.